Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Chancellor Philip Hammond is making a big Brexit speech later today. He's not exactly known for his oratorical prowess, but it's been billed as a strongly worded challenge to the EU and those so-called sceptics who think Britain can get an ambitious free trade agreement. He'll argue that Britain's financial services sector will have to be front and centre of any deal. The Chancellor will point out that every trade deal the EU has ever done has been unique, and given it was willing to offer some provision on financial services on previous talks with the US and with Canada, it's, quote, very much in our mutual interest to organise a deal going even further with the UK, the EU closest financial services partner by far, he says. Music from Brussels hasn't been very pleasant to British ears. The chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has previously claimed a free trade agreement open to financial services doesn't exist. Malstrike, could we agree to a deal that didn't include financial services?
Well, we're looking for a unique deal, and I've no doubt there will be a deal. And the reason there will be a deal is that
right. I know you think there's going to be a deal, but my question was: would we agree to a deal that did not include extensive coverage of financial services?
We will get a deal on financial services. So,
but would we agree to one if we didn't?
Well, by saying we'll get a deal, I'm excluding the possibility that we won't
get a deal. But you don't know for sure the position of Mr. Barnier at the moment. Now, look, it's his negotiating position. I understand that, and I don't fall into the trap that their negotiating position is there for the end game. I understand that too. But if in the end there isn't, he says, no on financial services, would we still do a deal?
Right. Well, I've said that I'm absolutely certain
I know
there will be a deal, and therefore I'm excluding the possibility there won't be a deal. And I'll tell you why there'll be a deal. Firstly, because in previous treaties, and you look at the negotiations around TTIP and CETA, etc., financial services have been an element of those agreements.
But quite a small
in a unique way. No, but this brings me on to my second point. The City of London is not Canada. It is a major financial provider to the whole of Europe. It provides competitive finance that supports European businesses, European consumers, and the European Union will be as concerned as we are that continues. So I don't think they are going to be going down the road of trying to fragment that business, because it will only benefit ultimately, not Paris and Frankfurt actually, but Hong Kong, New York and Singapore and financial centres like that. So we will be the same side of the table, more so than some of these opening salvos.
But do you accept that even a good deal, even if you're right and we get a good deal that includes financial services, it will still mean less access for financial services than now?
Well, it depends where the deal lands, but I am confident that whilst we will not go for passporting, because that would see us inside the single market.
So it will mean less access.
And as a rule taker, and that wouldn't be right, we will come to a bespoke arrangement with the European Union that will see the health of the city continue, and that's important to us. But it's equally important
my question was this: whatever the deal, even if it's a good deal, it will mean less access for financial services than now, correct?
Well, you will have to see that deal with the European Union in the context of our future as a globally facing trading nation. So it will free us up in all sorts of ways, and we can't predict what they are at the moment because we don't know what the deal is.
But it will mean less access, that's my point.
And do more outside of the European Union.
But it will mean less access to Europe.
Faster.
I mean, if it didn't, what did the Prime Minister mean when she said last week, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now? Well, if that wasn't a reference to financial services, what was?
That is a very pragmatic and sensible point to make.
So there will be less access.
It applies to both sides, but it applies to all areas potentially. Now, what we know is that the City of London is 11% of our economy. It pays about 70 billion in tax every year. It is hugely important to us, and it'll be very high up on our list of priorities, as indeed is why the Chancellor today is making his speech on this very subject. So it's right at the centre of the negotiation from our point of view, and I have no doubt that we will get a good and enduring, sensible deal.
Mr. Corbyn wants to take on the power of finance. That was his phrase last week. He wants to rebalance a distorted economy away from finance. So does it matter to Mr. Corbyn or to Labour that we may have less access than before?
No, it is important that we do have a deal, and I think that's been taken out of context. So what we would seek to do, as you know, Andrew, is to have a UK-EU customs agreement, which would include financial services, and
how does
it's
a customs
important.
union affect financial services?
Well, we would want to do the arrangement that we would come to with the EU would ensure that we have an arrangement around financial services as well.
But
Financial
financial services are covered by the single market, not the customs union.
You're talking about the customs union. We're talking
Or
about
a customs union.
Well, we're talking about a new customs.
Well, is there any
arrangement.
customs union in the world that involves financial services?
Well, yes, that was happening in terms of the arrangements that were being looked at in different.
Where?
I can't recall off the top of my head.
I'm not aware of the customs union being involved in financial services at all. If
You're
you
talking
want
about the customs union.
I'm talking about any customs union.
And we're breaking the mould here, Andrew.
I mean, there are
Just
no
because
tariffs on financial services. Customs unions
And
by the
that's-
access of tariffs.
and
What's a
that's
customs
why-
union got to do with financial services?
And that's why when we're negotiating a new arrangement with the EU, this will be part of that. So it's so important for the reason that Mel has given. But also, we have never, I don't think there's been any discussion ever about the impact on pensions, which comes up.
Well, that's important, but we haven't got time to go there. Let me ask you this. The one way of securing broadly the access that we have now for financial services would be to stay in the single market, not the customs union, the single market. Why doesn't Labour commit to that?
We are committed to fully accessing the single market without being a member of the single market. And these are subtle differences which
they're systemic differences if you're Mr. Barnier.
There are subtle differences in language but are completely and often misrepresented.
Mr. Stride, what did David Davis mean when he said that Parliament can't block Brexit even with a meaningful vote? The vote will have no impact on our departure. What did he mean by that?
Well, I can't speak for David Davis, but there will be a vote at the end on the final
deal. I know, but he
deal,
says it won't affect. It can't block
said, or when it was
Brexit,
said, or what. But
he says vote leave will have no impact on our departure. What does that mean?
Well, the vote on the final deal means that Parliament will finally decide whether that deal is acceptable.
But he seems to be implying that even if Parliament was to vote against the deal, it wouldn't impact on our departure. He said we're leaving on the end of March 2019. Even with a meaningful vote.
Okay, well, what's
the point of the vote then?
The position is very clear, and that is that there will be a final vote on the final deal, and Parliament as a.
But what's the point if it won't have an effect?
Decision. Well, as I say, I don't know in what context he said that, when he said it, or what. But the position, as you know, is extremely clear, albeit that that's.
So the vote could stop. The vote could stop us leaving.
Sorry.
A vote against could stop us leaving.
A vote could mean that Parliament would say that the deal was not acceptable.
And that could stop us leaving?
Well, I don't want to speculate on exactly where that would lead, but that we have been extremely clear as to what the vote means, and I don't think we've changed our position on that at any point.
Well, perhaps David Davis could clarify if he's watching. Now, the snow has thawed, but there's still one big question that remains unanswered from when the beast from the east swept through Westminster. Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss, posted this photo last week of a snowy Treasury garden, saying had to compete with loads of officials to get this shot. Nothing wrong with that, you might think, but hang on a moment. Let's look at this tweet from our guest of the day, Mel Stride, who works with Liz Truss in the Treasury Department. No officials in sight. So is the government spreading #fake news, Mel?
I don't know. I have a confession, Andrew, and you're the first to know this. I'm sure it's just the two of us having this conversation.
It is?
It wasn't me that took the photo, actually.
It wasn't.
So it came to my office via a security.
So it is fake news.
And I don't. It could be. It could have been photoshopped. She may never have been there.
Well, hold on a minute. Just hold your horses,
more.
because the eagle-eyed Daily Politics viewers will have spotted that Liz Truss wasn't photographing the snow at all. If you look closer, you can see that she's taking a photograph of an even rarer species, hardly ever seen in the wild. Yes, it is the Daily Politics mug.
During my talks in London last Thursday and in her speech last Friday, Prime Minister Theresa May confirmed that the UK will leave the single market, leave the customs union and leave the jurisdiction of DCJ. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the only remaining possible model is a free trade agreement. I hope that it will be ambitious and advanced, and we will do our best, as we did with other partners, such as Canada recently. But anyway, it will only be a trade agreement. I propose that we aim for a trade agreement covering all sectors and with zero tariffs on goods. Like other free trade agreements, it should address services. And in fisheries, reciprocal access to fishing waters and resources should be maintained. This positive approach doesn't change the simple fact that because of Brexit we will be drifting apart. In fact, this will be the first FTA in history that loosens economic ties instead of strengthening them. Our agreement will not make trade between the UK and the EU frictionless or smoother. It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit. To sum up, we will enter the negotiations of the future relations with the UK with an open, positive and constructive mind, but also with realism. From my point of view, the outcome of the negotiations must pass two key tests. The test of balance of rights and obligations. For example, the EU cannot agree to grant the UK the rights of Norway with the obligations of Canada. The test of integrity of the single market. No member state is free to pick only those sectors of the single market it likes, nor to accept the role of the ECJ only when it suits their interest. By the same token, a pick and mix approach for a non-member state is out of the question. We are not going to sacrifice these principles. It's simply not in our interest.
Chancellor Philip Hammond's giving a speech about Brexit. Let's listen in.
Leeds, Bristol, Belfast, Birmingham, Bournemouth, to name but a few. On Friday, the Prime Minister set out the UK's vision for its future economic partnership with the European Union, in a speech which answered the call to set out what we want, while being clear that we understand that this is a negotiation where both sides will need to give and take. As the Prime Minister said, our task, together with our European partners, is to deliver a Brexit that works for the UK and for the EU. A partnership that protects supply chains and established trade relationships, that backs businesses, safeguards jobs, and promotes the shared European values that we all hold. And the first step will be delivering on the implementation period, which was agreed as a fundamental part of the deal on withdrawal issues that we did in December, and which we expect to be formalised at the March European Council meeting. This implementation period is essential if we, and by we I mean all of us, businesses and citizens across all 28 countries, are to benefit from a smooth pathway to a future partnership between the UK and the EU. Nowhere will this be more important than in financial services, where we must work together to avoid the potential risks to financial stability that could arise if we faced a cliff edge in March 2019. But for the implementation period to deliver the smooth transition we all want to see, it needs to be effective. That means our regulators working together so that businesses, especially regulated businesses, are able to plan on the basis of it, giving full and meaningful effect to what we agreed in December, delivering clarity and certainty to businesses and citizens across Europe. The Prime Minister was clear in her speech that after we've left the EU, we'll be outside the single market and the customs union, but equally, we'll be free to cooperate closely with partners, including the EU, where it is in our mutual interest to do so. Financial services is such an area where we can and should collaborate closely, recognising that a future economic partnership will always need to ensure a fair balance of the rights and obligations associated with market access. Today, I want to build on the vision the Prime Minister delivered on Friday. I want to explain why it makes sense for both the UK and the EU that we continue to collaborate closely on cross-border financial services. I want to challenge the assertion that financial services cannot be part of a free trade agreement, to set out why it is in the interest of both the UK and the EU27 to ensure that EU businesses and citizens can continue to access the UK financial services hub, and how this is not a zero-sum game, where any loss of market share in London is automatically a gain to another EU capital. And I want to describe what a future financial services component of a comprehensive trade partnership agreement could look like. The UK financial services hub is an engine that powers the real economy, not just in the Europe, because the fact is that the UK financial services hub is not just a British asset, but a European asset too, supporting businesses, savers and citizens across the European Union, serving the whole of our continent and the world beyond. And not just serving Europe, but powered by the talent of hundreds of thousands of Europeans who work in it. And it's an asset of unparalleled in its history, its scale, its complexity, its agility, and its connectivity to the economies of Europe and the world. A global public good, as the IMF described it. EU passporting did not create the City of London, nor did some smart regulatory fix or government incentive. It is a combination of intangibles: language, legal system, time zone, culture, networks, risk appetite, regulatory approach, all blending together to create an ecosystem, an immensely potent combination of factors, impossible to replicate or perhaps even to map. Of course, having such a significant financial services industry brings to the UK huge benefits, but it is not cost-free. The UK economy bears the related risks, and UK taxpayers stand behind those risks, as we learned to our very real cost during the financial crisis, when those taxpayers provided support to financial sector firms to the tune of £136 billion. And that's not a lesson that we will forget. So even as a member of the EU, we have chosen to go higher and faster on regulatory standards at times to protect our taxpayers. And because we understand the risks we're taking, our commitment to rigorous and robust regulation will remain undimmed. David Davis was right in Vienna when he said that Britain's plan is for a race to the top in global standards. And because those risks are so significant, it is vital that the citizens of any country bidding to take on a bigger share of Europe's financial services market have a full and transparent understanding of them. The deep pools of capital, specialist skill and regulatory competence in London provide efficient, safe and high-quality services to the EU. We manage 1.5 trillion euros of assets on behalf of EU clients. Around two-thirds of debt and equity capital raised by EU corporates is facilitated by banks based in the UK. 78% of European FX trading and 74% of European interest rate derivatives trading takes place in the UK. These are services that businesses rely on to run their operations efficiently and with the benefit passed on to consumers in all 28 EU countries. And we should be under no illusion about the significant additional costs if this highly efficient market were to fragment. Costs that would be borne by Europe's businesses and consumers. Costs that industry bodies across Europe are beginning to recognise. The consultancy Oliver Wyman calculates that the wholesale banking industry would need to find between 30 and 50 billion US dollars of additional capital if new regulatory barriers forced fragmentation of firms' balance sheets. and London Stock Exchange Group estimate that the EU's proposal on location of clearinghouses, if implemented, would increase costs to EU 27 firms by around $25 billion a year by fragmenting the market and losing the efficiency of offsetting between trades. Already evidence is emerging of market actors reassessing their commitment to Europe in the face of potential regulatory fragmentation. For example, Intercontinental Exchange announced plans last month to launch daily gold futures contracts in the US next year, based on metal held in the UK. Those who think that the major winners from any fragmentation of London's markets would be Paris or Frankfurt or Dublin or Luxembourg should take note. The real beneficiaries are more likely to be New York, Singapore and Hong Kong, cutting Europe's market share and leaving Europe as a whole less competitive and more resilient on distant financial centres operating under very different rules. So it's time to address the sceptics who say that a trade deal, including financial services, cannot be done because it has never been done before. To them, I say every trade deal the EU has ever done has been unique. The EU's never negotiated the same arrangements twice. It has bespoke relationships with Turkey, Canada, Singapore, Korea. Every FTA has varying degrees of market access, depending on the countries involved, which is not surprising given the different economies and the different interests reflected in those agreements. In just the last hour or so, you'll have seen that the EU has published its draft negotiating guidelines. It is clear that a deal based wholly on precedent cannot deliver the depth and breadth of market access that these guidelines envisage. Because any trade deal between the UK and the EU must start from the reality of today, that our economies, including in financial services, are deeply interconnected, that our regulatory frameworks are effectively identical, that our supervisors and regulators work hand in glove to maintain the stability of our financial systems and have developed high levels of mutual trust, and that our businesses and citizens depend on cross-border financial services trade in their day-to-day lives far more than most of them will ever know, when they buy a car or take out a fixed-rate loan or hedge their fuel costs or insure an aircraft hull. The EU itself pursued ambitious financial services cooperation in its proposals for TTIP, which it described as a partnership that would be more than a traditional free trade agreement. And in its initial proposals for CETA, we know about this because back then British and French officials worked hand in hand on the proposals with the Commission. Both CETA and TTIP were intended to promote convergence between entirely separate markets with different rules and low levels of interconnectedness. We can do much better, given our starting point. At the time of the TTIP negotiations, people rightly argued that this was a challenging objective, but it need not be so in a partnership between the UK and the EU, because our markets are already so deeply interconnected. If it could be done with Canada or the USA, it could certainly be done with the UK. And there's another reason why it must be done. A trade deal will only happen if it is fair and balances the interests of both sides. Now, given the shape of the British economy and our trade balance with the EU 27, it's hard to see how any deal that did not include services could look like a fair and balanced settlement. So I'm clear not only that it is possible to include financial services within a trade deal, but that it is very much in our mutual interest to do so. But in making that statement, I do not minimise the challenges. I recognise that there will be many legitimate concerns. Concerns about the policing of rules once we're separate legal jurisdictions. Concerns about the legal framework for regulatory and supervisory cooperation. Concerns about the implications for financial stability and for the operation of Eurozone monetary policy. We stand ready to engage on all of these issues, and we've been giving a great deal of thought to how to address these concerns to ensure that all our economies continue to benefit, rather than simply throwing in the towel and allowing the market to fragment to everybody's cost. I will set out our initial thinking, but first let me say a word or two about financial stability, because we've come a very long way since the autumn of 2008. Working collaboratively across the EU and indeed beyond with international partners, we've increased the capital requirements of our banks, we've tightened supervision of their operations, and we've put in place resolution plans to avoid contagion should the worst happen to an institution. In the UK, of course, we've gone further and ring-fenced the retail banking operations of integrated groups from their wholesale market activities. So the risk now to financial stability is not from continued close cooperation and integration, it is from the opposite, breaking up the intense cooperation that has developed between regulators across the EU and the UK. Modern Europe is quite literally testament to the benefits of tearing down walls. Let us not now propose new barriers where there need be none between our successfully collaborating financial services regulators. So, building on the Prime Minister's speech last week, let's consider how we might structure a future partnership in financial services in a world beyond the single market and passporting. A partnership that enables the ongoing delivery of cross-border financial services in both directions, while protecting financial stability and consumers, businesses and taxpayers across the UK and EU. In my Mansion House speech last June, I set out 3 principles for a future partnership in financial services. A process for establishing regulatory requirements for cross-border trade between the UK and the EU, cooperation arrangements that are reciprocal, reliable and that prioritise financial stability, and a legal framework that makes this structure durable and reliable for participants in the market and for businesses who use their services. Today I want to describe how the vision of the Prime Minister's speech could shape those principles into a framework that could be the basis of a future partnership in financial services as part of a wide-ranging free trade agreement. We will start from a unique position with full alignment on day one. The challenge is what happens next. So the way forward must surely be to bank our day one de facto equivalence and shape a regime to manage future regulatory change that ensures that while our rule systems may evolve separately, we deliver fully equivalent regulatory outcomes, maintaining commitments to support open markets and fair competition. As these rules systems for financial services evolve, the United Kingdom cannot simply be an automatic rule taker. Let me explain why. We've invested heavily in the current rule book, and our industry is structured around it. And we hope very much that from day one, good sense, sound economics, and a commitment to mutual benefit will be the guiding principle of future rulemaking on both sides, often within the framework of internationally agreed regulatory standards. But because of the size of the UK's financial services market, around 10 times our GDP, and the complexity of the products traded on it, and the consequent risks our taxpayers bear, we cannot sign up to automatically accept as yet unknown future rule changes. We must have the ability, if necessary, to deliver an equivalent outcome by different means, maintaining our commitment to ensure access to each other's markets is on a fair and non-discriminatory basis, while protecting UK taxpayers from potentially unacceptable risks. Now, at first glance, this may appear to point to a solution based on the EU's established third country equivalence regime. But that regime would be wholly inadequate for the scale and complexity of the UK-EU financial services trade. It was never designed to carry such a load. The EU regime is unilateral and access can be withdrawn with little to no notice. Clearly, that is not a platform on which to base a multi-trillion-pound trade relationship. But the principle of mutual recognition and reciprocal regulatory equivalence, provided it is objectively assessed with proper governance structures, dispute resolution mechanisms, and sensible notice periods to market participants, clearly could provide an effective basis for such a partnership. And although we will be separate jurisdictions, we would need to maintain a structured regulatory dialogue to discuss new rules proposed by either side, building on our current unparalleled regulatory relationships to ensure that we deliver equivalent regulatory outcomes, agreeing mutually acceptable rule changes where possible, and where rules do evolve differently, we will need an objective process to determine whether they provide sufficiently equivalent regulatory outcomes, including not only looking at the rules themselves, but also assessing the way in which they are enforced in a specific jurisdiction, drawing on international standards where they exist, or on additional principles for equivalence where the UK and EU have more developed rules. Second, there would need to be continued close supervisory cooperation. The EU itself noted in the context of TTIP discussions that in too many instances, international standards have been implemented in a way that does not allow the relevant regulators and supervisors to work together, weakening the resilience of financial markets. We must not risk exacerbating that tendency. So while the UK would cease to be a part of the EU's supervisory agencies, there is no reason why we could not maintain a very close working relationship. Indeed, it would be an essential part of supporting the regulatory equivalence that I have described. For instance, through proactive and extensive information exchange authorised by the data sharing agreements within the overarching FTA, going far beyond what is available in ordinary third country relationships. It could cover market abuse, transaction reporting and stability monitoring, as well as prudential concerns about individual firms. And it could involve a version of today's college structures covering both day-to-day supervision and resolution in crisis. Of course, how each party organises its internal governance would be a matter for it. Neither party would have a role in the other's governance processes. But we should be able to build on the extraordinary level of supervisory collaboration and trust that already exists between the EU and UK authorities to establish the most comprehensive supervisory cooperation arrangements anywhere in the world, protecting our respective financial systems and our taxpayers from instability risks. We recognise also that the supervision of major clearinghouses conducting euro-denominated activity is a particularly important and sensitive subject for our EU partners, and we stand ready to discuss a mutually satisfactory way forward in this area. The supervisory cooperation that I've described does not involve either party transferring any responsibility for its rules or ceding any sovereignty. And that leads me to the third principle. As the Prime Minister said on Friday, in certain circumstances, we may choose not to maintain equivalent outcomes, but we will know that there may be consequences if we do so. We would have to address how this future partnership would work in such circumstances, with clear institutional processes to do so. Our concern in a financial services partnership would be to ensure that any such consequences were reasonable and proportionate, applied in a predictable way that allows industry to plan with confidence, and that they were delivered through an independent arbitration mechanism that has the confidence of both parties. Such mechanisms already exist within free trade agreements, including CETA. The Prime Minister was clear on Friday that we've decided to leave the EU, and we accept that there will be consequences. We do not expect the same relationship we have today across all areas of activity in financial services. Trade-offs should be expected, and the industry will change. But we should ensure that the future partnership strengthens European stability and prosperity rather than weakening it. The ideas I've set out today suggest a way to move forward, to shape a potential partnership in financial services based on the core concept of fair and non-discriminatory competition, recognising legitimate concerns where they exist, but drawing a distinction between those concerns and protectionism or political expediency which would undermine that competition. What I've set out today is a possible route to a future partnership grounded in logic, pragmatism and compromise. A partnership that would protect Europe's financial stability and underpin one of its great competitive advantages. And I look forward to constructive engagement with our friends and partners in the EU to take these ideas forward. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take some questions now, and I'm going to go to Kamal Ahmed from the BBC first. Kamal.
Thank you, Chancellor. Kamal Ahmed from the BBC. Don't Donald Tusk's comments this morning show the huge gulf still between the European Union and the UK government? He talked about negative economic consequences. He talked about no pick and mix. And also, could you specifically respond to his comments about Theresa May? He characterised the Prime Minister's position as being political, suggesting that Brexit would be a success at any price. And he went on to say that that is not the EU's objective.
Well, look, let me, first of all, I didn't see the Donald Tusk appearance myself, so I've seen reports of it, but obviously I've been travelling to get here. But the EU is a very skilled negotiator. They've done this many times before, not precisely this, but they've negotiated agreements with many countries. They're very skilled and very disciplined in the way they carry out their negotiation. And it doesn't surprise me remotely that what they've set out this morning is a very tough position. That's what any competent, skilled and experienced negotiator would do. I expect that we will have a deep and constructive engagement with them. And I hope that what I've set out here this afternoon will contribute to the discussion that we'll be having. Adam Parsons from Sky here. Adam.
Yeah, Adam Parsons from Sky News. Chancellor, this city is full of nervous international financial institutions, probably including this one, who are mulling over moving headquarters and jobs to other countries. And the one thing they want is clarity over the future. And here you've told them exactly what they wanted to hear, except these are also the things that the EU has explicitly said it will not give you. You've now ruled out equivalence, which appeared to be the middle ground that lots of people would have accepted. What can you say right now to these international banks to persuade them not to move jobs and buildings out of the City of London?
Well, I hope anybody won't be moving any buildings. That would be very dramatic. First of all, just to be clear, I haven't ruled out equivalence. What I've said is that the EU's model of equivalence, which is unilateral, withdrawable on no notice in some cases, and isn't underpinned by a robust objective assessment structure, would not work. It was never designed to work for major financial market flows. It's something much less robust. And what I've said explicitly this afternoon is that I think the principle of equivalence, if it's based on a mutual agreement, it's robust and enduring. It's underpinned by objective analysis of whether equivalence exists in a given situation, and there are proper procedures, arbitration arrangements and notice under it, could be the basis on which we could move forward. But let me deal with your specific question, because I understand the point. You're absolutely right. And the key here is the implementation period, which we've been talking about, which we agreed with the EU as part of the December package, and which we expect to get confirmed formally in the European Council later this month. That will assure businesses that the deadline, if you like, the cliff edge has moved forward 21 months to the end of December 2020, allowing us time to take forward this negotiation with our EU partners around all the complex areas of our future partnership. Robert Peston? Oh, Robert.
Chancellor, yeah, it's a slightly better day for me because I just might remember who I am and where I'm working. It's Robert Peston, ITV.
Got it right.
The EU's negotiating guidelines today explicitly ruled out the kind of mutual recognition regime that the Prime Minister wants and which you have set out today for your financial services deal that you want. So why don't you just face up to reality, recognise that all they're prepared to do is a bog-standard Canada-style free trade arrangement and get on with it?
Because I don't think that's the case, Robert. I think if you read the aspiration that the EU itself is setting out for our future relationship, it couldn't be contained within a straightforward FTA. The EU itself has noted that because of the proximity of the UK and the European Union, because of the complexity and scale of existing trade flows, in many respects, a simple free trade agreement would leave many questions unresolved that would have to be resolved, because the relationship between the UK and European Union countries will never be the same as the relationship between Canada and European Union countries because of the different nature of the trade. Nearly all of, or a very large proportion of our trade with the EU is ro-ro trade across the Channel, whereas almost all of the trade between Canada and the EU will be containerised sea freight or air freight. It's a different type of trade. Much of our exports to the EU are intermediate goods going into complex supply chains.
Well, that there, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, giving his vision for future trade dealings with Europe after Brexit. He said that the City of London is not just a British asset, but a European one. We're deeply connected and absolutely no reason why we can't stay that way. Contrast that with the words earlier today of the EU President Donald Tusk saying that because of Brexit, we will be drifting further apart. It shows how much negotiation there is still to be done.
The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has told Theresa May that there can be no pick-and-mix approach to Brexit. He was responding to the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech last week. He said Mrs May wanted to demonstrate at any price that Brexit could be a success, but that was not the EU's objective. Meanwhile, the Chancellor Philip Hammond said any deal that didn't include Britain's service sector, which includes banks, would not be a fair deal. Our political editor Laura Kuhnsberg reports.
A different Mansion House, this time in a Luxembourg garden. But there's strife ahead, even in the most tranquil continental surroundings. The European Union revealed its response to Theresa May's plans for Brexit.
It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit. A pick-and-mix approach for a non-member state is out of the question. We are not going to sacrifice these principles. It's simply not in our interest.
Unfortunately, and we have to know, there will be no winners after the Brexit. Both sides will be losing.
The EU's been united with that gloomy message. But it was only on Friday the Prime Minister said she wanted an ambitious trade partnership with the bloc, but accepted compromises would be made. So how do the two sides compare? Well, the EU guidelines of a possible deal say there will be negative economic consequences. And while the Prime Minister said all agreements mean picking and choosing, the EU insists the UK can't cherry-pick the bits of the EU it likes. But the unions accepted the goal of a trade deal where there are no tariffs, taxes on imports or exports. But controversially, only if the EU keeps access to fish British waters. But crucially, there is space to budge. The document says if the UK positions were to evolve, the union will be prepared to reconsider its offer. And there is the chance of brokering some kind of limited deal over services, including the giant money machine of the City of London, where the Chancellor shrugged off the Brussels position.
They're very skilled and very disciplined in the way they carry out their negotiation. And it doesn't surprise me remotely that what they've set out this morning is a very tough position.
But Labour claims the government's approach is all over the place.
We can change the tone into one of mutual interest, mutual respect. We can get the deal that will protect our economy and protect jobs.
There are big gaps between what the government wants and what the EU is willing to give. And it's clear it's easier for Brussels, not Westminster, to call the shots. But in this long, tortured process, today is not a moment of political panic. It's clear from both sides, and from these guidelines, there is a real conversation to be had. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Our economics editor Kamal Ahmed is here. So the UK's financial services proving to be another big Brexit sticking point. Is there any sign of a way out of it?
Well, I think, Sophie, as with all negotiations, the two sides tend to start a long way apart, and then they tend to come towards some form of agreement. And we mustn't forget both sides say they want a deal. I think there was a small window opened by Donald Tusk. I'll say it no more than that. He did say there would be, the EU was willing to look at trade in services. And that obviously could include financial services, so important to the UK economy. We employ 2 million people in financial services across the UK. But also, Philip Hammond made the point, very important to the European Union. Their businesses, their governments use the deep capital pools in London to fund their operations. Philip Hammond said it's no time for a brick wall between Britain and the EU on financial services, but he did admit, and I think Donald Tusk would agree with him here, there will be costs. Britain's relationship with the European Union after Brexit will not be as good on financial services as it is now.
Kamal, thank you.
Now, more complicated, more costly, and no cherry-picking the best bits out of a future deal. That's Donald Tusk's message to Britain about the post-Brexit world, warning that nothing about it would be frictionless or smooth. Already, the future of financial services is proving a major sticking point. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, insisting again today it should be included in a future trade settlement, claiming that would be in everyone's interest. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Only 5 days ago, Theresa May called out across the Channel for a post-Brexit relationship with a whole series of special arrangements to keep us economically close to the EU. Today, the European Union responded. We are moving apart. Barriers are going up. You've asked to come out of our rules and institutions, so you'll get the sort of free trade agreement the EU gave Canada.
Because of Brexit, we will be drifting apart. In fact, this will be the first FTA in history that loosens economic ties instead of strengthening them. Our agreement will not make trade between the UK and the EU frictionless or smoother. It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit.
Donald Tusk was unveiling the EU's draft guidelines for the negotiation on the future relationship with Britain. And they spell out how the EU believes Britain's negotiating red lines preclude a really deep relationship in the future. The document spells out there will be new frictions in trade, checks and controls at the border. Brexit, unfortunately, will have negative economic consequences. The overall message of the document is we will take some economic pain from Brexit to protect our rules and institutions, but it's going to hurt you more. In a speech at HSBC's London headquarters, the Chancellor called for financial services to be included in the post-Brexit free trade agreement, even though the EU guidelines exclude that possibility. The Chancellor said the whole document should be seen as the EU's opening bid.
It doesn't surprise me that their position in their guidelines is we would like a great deal of the thing that the British will be reluctant to concede and very little at all on offer of the things that the British will regard as most important. That is probably not a bad opening strategy for anyone engaged in a negotiation process. So I do think you have to see this as a negotiating strategy.
The draft guidelines say the EU is willing to explore ways of minimising the hassle of customs checks that will inevitably pop up post-Brexit. But it also says that it's going to hold Britain to higher standards than it does usual trading partners, because Britain is just so big and so close. The document spells out that the EU will aim for a zero tariff deal across all goods, including agriculture. Now, there's no guarantee that will actually happen. And the same document also says existing reciprocal access to each other's fishing waters should be maintained.
We're very clear that we're taking control of our waters. But of course, we will be open to discussing with our EU partners about the appropriate arrangements for reciprocal access for our fishermen to EU waters and for EU fishermen to our waters. We'll have to negotiate the basis on which such an arrangement could be fair and appropriate for us.
A glimpse perhaps of the trade talks haggling between different sectors still to come. The Chancellor said any agreement must include financial services, which the EU guidelines exclude, though the EU does say their positions could change if the UK position evolves in the months ahead.
Gary Gibbon.
It was perhaps as inevitable as it was unwelcome to Theresa May. A more or less flat rejection of her vision of Brexit was issued today by the other 27 members of the European Union. No tailored trade deal. Even her compromises, like sticking with EU regulations on medicines, air travel and the chemical industry, were turned down. OK, there is time to negotiate, but the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, was pretty clear. There could be no pick and mix, he said. No Woolworths strategy, you could say.
Britain's Prime Minister wants a deep and special trade deal with the EU despite her red lines or refusal to accept all EU obligations. Now, the EU's President says we can only have a deal that's shallower and more ordinary precisely because of her red lines. So here he was today, warning us that the rest of the European Union isn't afraid of what he sees as the inevitable costs of Brexit for them and for us.
Our agreement will not make trade between the UK and the EU frictionless or smoother. It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit. A pick and mix approach for a non-member state is out of the question. I fully understand and of course I respect Theresa May's political objective. To demonstrate at any price that Brexit could be a success and was the right choice. But sorry, it is not our objective, of course.
Now back home, the Chancellor was in the City of London, outlining why he thinks it's in the EU's interest to allow privileged access for British financial services firms to their giant market. Despite Brussels' strong signals, that's not going to happen.
Why don't you just face up to reality, recognise that all they're prepared to do is a bog-standard, Canada-style free trade arrangement and get on with it?
When we're doing something which is unique in the history of world trade arrangements, we're taking a market which is highly integrated and we're moving it apart. We're separating it apart. That is different from anything anybody's ever done before in a trade agreement, and suggesting that we use an off-the-shelf agreement that was designed to bring two distant markets closer together for this purpose is not really credible, I think.
But so much of what May wanted, such as the continued absence of costly checks on imports and exports at borders, has been rejected. Any hope her plan can be rescued?
There are mutual benefits for both sides, giving and taking a bit in this process. But I think actually the really bespoke agreement is going to be difficult to negotiate in the time we've got available.
Red lines everywhere you look. And the EU did say that if May would only drop her red lines, like a refusal to allow the European Court of Justice to boss us in any way, she'd get a better deal. That's a red light for her. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, with Donald Tusk's insistence that pick and mix is out of the question, what have we learned today about what each side wants? Well, first, what they agree on, and it's not much. Both sides want security cooperation to continue uninterrupted, and the EU says it's happy for research cooperation to continue. The EU also wants free trade in goods. The UK wants this too, but there is literally a catch. The EU wants continued EU fishing access to UK waters. Hard sell to hard Brexiteers. The UK wants free trade not just in goods, but in services too, especially financial services. The EU has raised objections, but in today's document, they simply don't mention it at all. And the EU has ruled out the UK's plan for associate membership in EU institutions like aviation, chemicals and medicine. But the government isn't giving up yet. We can talk again now to Robert Peston after that little run through. So I suppose this is the essence of negotiation, really, what we're seeing here. The Prime Minister said that she knew she wouldn't get everything she wanted, but what is this going to amount to?
Well, the real problem for her is that the core of what she wanted has been rejected. She set forward a system of so-called mutual recognition of standards in goods and services, and she hoped that would mean that the non-tax costs, the non-tariff costs for exporters and importers would be reduced. That would mean that there wouldn't be those burdensome checks at borders of the standards that goods have been produced to, where they come from and all of that. And it's those costs that are particularly worrying for big international companies in the UK. Problem for Theresa May is the rest of the EU said today pretty loudly, no way T May. And if I'm honest, I don't really see a way back for her on that. So she faces a very big domestic political agenda, which is whether to sacrifice some of those red lines that her Brexiter supporters hate, like will she allow a bigger role for the European Court of Justice, or has she got to go where the Labour Party wants her to go? Or has she got to say, actually, we're just going to get a very basic free trade deal and risk alienating many people in Parliament, including some of her Remain supporting Tory MPs.
After all that work of that cabinet away day, it's extraordinary. Robert, thank you very much indeed for that.
So we now know
I've been getting away with it all